Hi there everyone, this is the week 2 lecture for Work Immersion-ICT Animation entitled Introduction to Project Management. So under this lesson, we're going to focus on 4 important things: a short introduction to project management, scope, requirement elicitation, and 5 process groups. So under requirement elicitation, this is something that you won't necessarily need for your activities right now. However, it's necessary later on when you're going to actually interview your client and you're going to actually create the project. So with that one, let's look into a little bit of what project management is, specifically what is a project. So more or less, this word is the stuff of nightmares because once you hear this word, everything tends to freeze over. However, the fact of life is, regardless of what you're going to do after senior high school, you may as well have to do something about this. So let's look into it. So what is a project? So this is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. So 2 important keywords here is the word temporary and the words product, service, or result. So whatever you have to do done temporarily is considered as a project. So for example, creating a program is considered as a project. Going to school every day is not considered a project because you're kind of expected to do it in a very long amount of time. Well, at least after you graduate senior high school or whatever. So whenever you're going to create a project, you tend to look into a process. So a process are certain types of steps that gets repeated in an organization to deliver service, product, or information. So these processes, if you're going to look at different projects, they may have different results. So you can either create an animation, a program, a specific product that may be food, a service. However, whenever you're going to create a certain project, you tend to undergo through the same steps. So of course, you'll have to actually initiate creating a project, planning it, and so on and so forth. So to further understand what the project is, let's look into its characteristics. Number 1, it has to have a definable goal. So what is the purpose of your project? Are you doing it simply for fun, or are you doing it for a bigger purpose? Next one, it has interrelated and dependent activities and tasks. So whenever you're doing something in a project, you have to more or less cooperate with someone else. That's why when you're doing a project, you tend to be in a group. It's very rare that you see a project and then you work individually. It is possible, however, it's rare. And at the same time, it doesn't deliver the same results as doing it in a team. Next one is that it's finite in duration. So it's something that's temporary. It's something that won't necessarily happen forever, or at the very least at a very long amount of time. Next one is to provide a unique product, service, or information. So in your case, it's going to be either a program or an animation. And it usually operates under scope, quality, cost, and time restraints. So regardless of what project you're going to do, you have all of these 4 constraints. We're going to look into those ones later. So now with that one out of the way, what is project management? So project management is defined as the application of knowledge, skills, tools, and technique to meet project requirements. So with this one, whenever you're going to create a project, there are a lot that you have to do. So you need a certain type of way for you to be able to achieve that in the most efficient and effective way possible. So your project management, there are a lot of parts to it. It can be defined in accordance to, let's say, the type of work that you're doing, or it can be accomplished through the use of the 5 group processes, which we're going to look into later. So under the tasks of project management, these are not the 5 process groups, but these are usually the processes that you will have to do. So of course, you have their planning, scheduling, managing, coordinating. You also have their leading, communicating, controlling, and so on and so forth. So these are just quite limited. There's actually a lot more that you can do. Also expectedly, there are some things that other people won't have to do. Like for example, leading, we have a project manager. So in some cases, other members in the team won't necessarily get to lead. With the project management, there is always a project manager. So the project manager is the person assigned by the performing organization to achieve the objectives. So the project manager is not supposed to be the one who wants a certain project. So you need to have someone who is asking you to do it, which is a client, and that is separate from your project manager. So here are the skills that a project manager has to have. So later on, if you're going to have your project, it's not only the project manager who should have the following skills. Of course, everyone should be able to have these following skills, not only now but also later on, which will be more valuable when you actually go to either employment or create your own business, and then you actually encounter creating a project with a certain type of people and you're going to lead it. So technical knowledge is how you're going to actually do it. So knowing the programming language, knowing how to use the software. So knowing these elements is very necessary. However, you should not be an expert to it. So that means you don't really have to know how to, let's say, code in Java 100%. You just need to know how it works. Next one is project management processing. So how you're going to create a project and understanding the project as a whole. So you have to know the ins and outs of creating a project. Next one, very important, leadership skills. Next one is the task and the human. So for this one, it's more of assigning the task and then the person who is creating the task. So how are you going to delegate it? How are you going to monitor it? How are you going to deal with that person if in case something goes awry? We also have here different roles, so this is not everything. So first of all is the integrator versus the technical expert. This is what I've been saying, wherein you don't have to be an expert in, let's say, animating or programming. You just need to know how it works, and then you need to be able to assign the right people on who will do the job. So with this one, you need to have some certain type of knowledge to that one so that you know that what they're doing is actually correct. Another important thing for a project manager is the politics. So if ever you go into a supervisor position, or wherein you're in a position wherein you're going to lead a certain amount of people, you tend to represent that team. So how are you going to represent that team to other teams? So with that one, politics is basically that, but at the same time, everything that has to be done. So within your team, coordinating with other teams, and also coordinating with the client and the organization. The project manager should also need to know how to deal with the big picture and the detail. So of course, it's really important for you to have the details to make sure that everything is working smoothly. However, at the same time, you should not be engrossed with the details so much that you forget the big picture, to the point that you add so many unnecessary details that it's not really needed. And with that one, ultimately, you'll be delayed by creating your project. So it's really important for the project manager to be able to look into these two different sides, go back and forth from them within all of the time, and then you need to be able to see as well how the details in the project integrate, coordinate together in order to create the big picture. So here we have the project constraints. So whenever you're going to create a project, regardless of how small that is, you need to have the following things to look into. So you have there the scope, which answers the question, how big is the project and what does it include? So what are the details? What's the big picture? Quality, how good this project has to be. So it's kind of a given in a project, you have to give the best quality. However, due to other project constraints, that may be something that you can't necessarily do. Another one is the cost. So how much is there to be paid or spent to do the project? It's not just about creating or having the necessary tools and equipment. You also need to look into, let's say, transportation, food, other really small things that you don't really think about. However, it's something that would contribute to your actual cost. So to give you an example, going outside and then meeting, that's still part of the cost of creating a project. So when you go to town and you meet at someone else's house, you have to think of what you're going to eat there and all of those things. So that's still part of the cost, regardless of how small it is or how insignificant it is. It's still part of the cost. And then the last one is the time. How long does it take to make this project? So this is going to be one of the biggest, of course, constraints, yung time that, the time, especially for us. So when you're looking into project constraints, you tend to have, you have something that you tend to sacrifice. So you can't just have everything there. It's possible for you to have all of these ones. However, it's going to take a Herculean task. So for example, you can see here we have a triangle. So what would happen here is that if you choose two, then tendency is that you would have to sacrifice one. So scope and quality, this is really interesting, is because they tend to go hand in hand together. So how you define your scope will also define the quality. That's not always exclusive. However, based on observation or based on experience, it's usually how it works. So for example, we have here, let's say you want a high quality project, yet at the same time you want to lower the cost. So with that one, you would need a little bit more time. So for example, for these ones are usually indie games. So you tend to see like a lot of indie games. Of course, they don't have a lot of costs, but they tend to create good they want to create good quality content. They tend to make they tend to create years of it. So they need years for them to actually create those ones. Possible if you would like to increase your scope or your quality, but at the same time have a faster time, then you would need to have costs. So the cost mostly comes from probably the equipment and at the same time the people who will have to do it. So if you want something done faster, of course you'll have to look into an expert, and their fees may be a bit higher than expected. If you want lesser cost, lesser time, tendency is that you would have lesser scope yet and at the same time lesser quality. So that's just an example of project constraints. So other project constraints are the following. So you have the risks, you have the resources, which is usually part of cost, and of course so we have that one. Next one is scope. So for your scope, there are three types of scopes. So these are the limitations of your project. So under product scope, this focuses on the characteristics of the product, service, or the results that the project will be undertaken to create. So this is more on how the quality and the quality of your project or your product. So how many details is it in there and all of those things. So the goal of product scope is to address how it works, address how it's physically made. So for probably animation and programming, it's more on the programming language and the software that you will have to use, and also how to address it, how it can be improved in future iterations. However, for the third part, it's not really necessary, as with a project, it's something that's temporary. So if you want a high quality scope, then you would have to include the third. Next one is project scope. So the project scope, this focuses more on how you're actually going to create it. So for the project scope, these are the works performed to deliver the product, service, or result within the specified features and functions. So with this one, it's actually the project management itself. So how many people you're going to have, the cost that you have, the time that you have. And then the total scope, which is the combination of everything. So your product scope as well as your project scope. Next one is requirement elicitation. So really important thing right off the bat is for you to understand what your scope is. So how you're going to know your scope is through the use of requirement elicitation. So this is also known as requirement gathering, which is the practice of researching and discovering the requirements of a product from users, customers, and also other stakeholders. So the requirement is kind of like the scope. So these are the features that the product must find, and also some of the constraints that the product must satisfy. So the things that you need and the things that you don't need for you to create the entire project. Sometimes this is also called as features. So we have here types of requirements. So these are the things that you would look into before you actually ask. So first of all, functional requirements. So these are more of the technical details, so calculations, technical details, or other functions that a product is supposed to do. So for this one, it focuses more on what the system or what the product can do for the actors or the users. It doesn't necessarily care, let's say, how it's going to perform later on in terms of, let's say, its viewing screen, but it focuses more, will it satisfy the person who is using it or the audience who will be viewing it. Next one is non-functional requirements. So for non-functional requirements, these are the ones these are more of, let's say, things that we don't necessarily think of. However, it affects the performance of your functional requirements. So we have examples like performance, reliability, availability, and quality of service. So for example, in an animation, for the functional requirements, you have to place there the content that you need to have. For non-functional requirements, you have to know, let's say, the quality. So will you be exporting it in 720p or in 1080p or in 4K? That depends. And then the last one is pseudo requirements. So pseudo requirements, these are requirements imposed by the client. So these can either be functional or non-functional. So whenever you're going to do these types of requirements, the pseudo requirements are kind of like the non-negotiables. To an extent, you can still negotiate with them. However, for the client, these are small details, not necessarily part of the big picture that they want to really focus on. So for example, let's say the client wants it to be around 4 to 5 minutes long. So regardless of your content, regardless of your quality, you need to be able to place so much information only to 4 to 5 minutes long. It can also be must run both offline and online. So maybe the system is much better if it's done online. It doesn't matter. It has to work either both offline or online. Other considerations that we have to look into when we're going to do requirement elicitation is if something is correct, complete, consistent, unambiguous, realistic, verifiable, and as well as traceable. So these are the things that you have to look into when you're creating your questions. So here are the challenges when you're going to create your requirement elicitation. So first of all is the scope. So for this one, the scope itself, like, do you want to add a lot of details or do you want to add smaller details? So that would really, again, the scope would most likely affect the quality, and then at the same time would affect your cost as well as your time. So also adding so many unnecessary details may blur you from the actual big picture. Next one is problems of understanding. So this is where your communication skills come in. So when you're going to talk to a client, you're not necessarily sure if they are IT literate or not. So that means they understand the jargon that IT student or IT professionals or students say. So let's say when you say the word feature, they may not really know what feature is. They probably think that it's a highlight that you have to do. But for us, it's just a requirement that you have that you need. In terms of animation, they may not necessarily know what style they want to have. However, and you really have to explain the difference between Japanese or Japanese and Western, or if you're going to use traditional or 2D. So with that one, you really have to find a way to explain to your client how everything works. In a way that they would be able to understand, and also for them not to tamper with their answers. Another challenge that we have is volatility. So if you have a longer time, tendency is that the requirements may change. One day your client might talk to you and they might say, may nakita silang ganito sa ibang company, they may want to add it. So that would again affect your scope. So with that one, something that really affects that is the time. So if you have a longer time, tendency is that the scope would change as much as possible. So it's your responsibility as a member of the project management to let them know that these are the constraints that you have, and if you keep on looking into them, that would be a waste of your time and your resources. Yet at the same time, when you're going to create a project, there are some things in the planning and initiating state that you don't necessarily think about, and once you're already building it or creating it, then you realize that it's something necessary. So the change of requirements isn't necessarily bad. However, changing it so much might affect the overall cost, the overall time, and other project restraints. So when you're doing requirement elicitation, there are a lot of techniques. So you have the very common one is of course doing the interview with your client, but we have other ways, like let's say questionnaire, focus group discussion, observing the system or observing it. This is much better if you're actually within that system, and it's also the reason why we chose UCSHS, so you won't have to be foreign with all of the processes that we have. You can also have a workshop, brainstorming, role-playing, immersion. So for the immersion, tendency is that you would go to their company and experience what they're doing. Other techniques that we have is prototyping and design thinking. So for this one, it's going to be focused more on your inquiry subject by Sir Ibrahim. So I won't be talking that so much here. And now let's move on. So on requirement elicitation, regardless of whichever technique you're going to do, you tend to have 3 steps. So first of all, you have to identify the actors. Actors tend to mean the users, the audiences, and what they're going to do with their animation or with your system. So how are they going to interact with it? What are they supposed to do with it? What can they access? What can they not access? Next one is to identify scenarios. So scenario is defined as a description of what actors do as they use the product. So these are more of the things that they have to do. You also have to limit what they can and they cannot do. So of course, a system administrator has full access, whereas probably a simple employee won't necessarily have as much access as a system administrator. Next one is to identify the non-functional requirements. So here we have a few examples. You don't have to necessarily ask all of these ones. You just have to look into what are the things that are needed. For your requirement elicitation, these are just sample questions that you can ask for your client later on in the future. In the future, we will be providing you a list of sample questions that would aid you. But to give you a rough idea of what you need to ask, here are some of the following. So really important are the current processes, problems found in the current process, possible suggestions of how to solve the problem. So with this one, you can kind of see the pattern with your practical research. So in terms of project management or actually creating a system or an animation, it would differ around here. So the needs of the feature, pieces of the feature, and also the steps of using said features. Other questions would be where the product will be deployed. Will it be under Windows? Will it be offline? Will it be online? The target audiences, especially for animation. So the UI is really important, or user interface is really important. The style that you want to do will be affected based on the target audience. How to access certain features. So again, not every single actor in your system would be able to use all of the features. Limitations to system usage, a part of the previous one. Hardware capabilities, so if their computer has only probably 2 GB RAM, will it still be able to run? Verification and validation steps, so this is more of after or around the later stages, and as well as the time required. So this is part of your constraints. So as stated, whenever you're going to do a requirement elicitation, The best and the easiest way to do is to actually interview your client. So here are just a few tips for interviews. I'm just going to skim a little bit through them. So preparing the interview. So if you remember your practical research too, more or less they're kind of like the same, like preparing your interview questions, setting a proper date, time, and room, confirm if they are okay with video and audio recording. Don't just go there assuming that they would like to, and to review any constraints. Next one is to establish rapport with your client through this interview. So rapport basically means establishing a connection with your client. Not necessarily becoming friends with them, but making it in such a way that interviewing you would be comfortable. So there's no holds bar or anything. You would be comfortable talking to your client, and your client would be comfortable talking to you. Not to the point that you're friends, but it's enough for you to set a stage wherein any kind of question that is necessary may be answered. Of course, take down notes while the client is answering your questions. Also, practicing active listening. Other tips include to observe professionalism throughout the entire interview. So you'll be interviewing UCSHS faculty members or staff. So with that one, of course, maintaining a sharp appearance is necessary. And also, it's really important that in the initial requirement elicitation, all of your queries have to be answered. And if ever there are some things that you don't necessarily agree with your client, please try to settle it as early as possible. So if you think the scope is too much, you're not able to do this, there's too much, given the time and the cost, there might not be a lot of scope that you can do. So as much as possible, try to negotiate as early as now so that you can set an agreement. So with that one, let's move on to the last part, your 5 process groups. So the project process is a collection of logically related project activities that culminates in the completion of one or more deliverables or your actual project. So whenever you're going to create a project, you tend to undergo these 5 general processes. So under this one, you have here 5. So we'll be starting off with initiating processes, and then planning, executing, and then together with that one, you'll have to monitor and control. First part is initiating. So when you're initiating a project, you have to first identify the project object or need. So what is your deliverable? What is the product service information that you need to have? And at the same time, if possible, you can start already with the features. Next one, you also have to figure out who your stakeholders are. So your stakeholders, these are the people who will be influenced, affected, and who will basically be affected within your project. So you also have to know who your customer is. So your customer is a type of a stakeholder. So this is the person who you will be handing the product, the service, the deliverable to. You also have to figure out the needed people. So this is more of your team. And to have a short idea of what your resources are going to be, that also includes your project constraints. So your time, cost, quality, scope. Next one is we have planning. So under planning, you have to identify all of the work that needs to be done. So you need to know already the very basics of your project based from the initiating phase. Now you have to look into how you're going to do them before you actually create them. So in order to know your project work, you'll have to divide them into tasks, and also you'll have to identify the resource requirements. You will also have to develop project documents that will be used to carry out the project. So this is basically your game plan or your project plan. So you need to identify or to outline every single thing that you need to have. Anyway, there's going to be a format on that one. You also have to need to know the risks, what are the hindrances that you may have along the way, and also how to plan for them. Next one is execution. Execution is actually creating the project. So before the planning stage, you haven't done anything. So no creating of software yet, no creating of animation yet. However, in the case of animation, it's possible for you to start already creating the storyboard here and the layout, so anything within the pre-production stages. For programming, of course, you'll have to know your flowcharts and all of those things. Upon execution, this is where you actually move on with the production process for animation and creating the system or the software for programming. So it's really important for you to track your progress, to maintain your control, and also communicate with your teammates and also your stakeholders during this execution. Also, around execution time, it is expected that there will be changes. So these changes are anticipated more or less, and adjustments are made and recorded. Next one is monitoring. So monitoring is usually done with executing. So monitoring is tracking, reviewing, and regulating the progress and performance of the project. So you have to look into if the project is actually moving smoothly. So it's not just about creating something just because to end something, but you also have to look into the quality, the scope, the time, and the cost that you have to do. So identify any areas which changes to the plan are required and also initiate any corresponding changes. So this can be done during the execution itself. However, if your planning is really done well, then you would have anticipated this one. It is also important for you to control your changes and to recommend any corrective or preventive action. It's not right for you to always just keep on doing changes, especially if that deters you from your actual scope. So you have to know what are the changes that are necessary and the changes that aren't really necessary. And then the last part is the closing. So the closing, this is more of finalizing the activities of the project. You can also do validation and verification of the project here to confirm all of your deliverables and to actually hand it over to your customer and then determine if they are satisfied or not. So that ends our introduction to project management. If you have any questions, you may ask me through Facebook Messenger, through Gmail, our Facebook Classroom. If there are comments under this video, I'll also be answering them. So good day, and I hope this helps you with your activities.